Moleko. At this stage, and I mean, there's a lot of documents to go through. We've just gone through the speech, just under an hour or so. What stands out for you?
So the question that the South African people want to know is, there's economic stagnation. Has what the minister announced been sufficient and adequate to respond to the economic stagnation that we've seen? We've heard him say 1.8% growth is what is targeted for the out years. 2% has been a slight adjustment now with the recent announcement. We've seen taxes are going to remain as is. In fact, surprisingly, corporate income tax has been reduced by a percentage point. That sticks to the investment-led strategy, making business conducive environment, which is what the ANC policy environment and regime has been, and there is no surprise there. But the real question is, to what extent will we see GDP growth stimulated further beyond what we want before COVID? So the 2% growth that he is targeting for this year, the outer years, is pretty much where we were in 2019. There is no change. 2019 we were in an economic crisis, except we didn't have 12.5 million people in unemployment. We had at that point 10 million. And so we're seeing a worsening of the situation. And I think, Stephen, the situation now, the constrained growth, the projections that we have seen, we have to have an alternative paradigm. We are not seeing the type of reforms that are going to present to us different outcomes. The question that we should also ask is, what will the impact of all the regimes that have been put in place be, in addition to growth? What will they do to unemployment? What will they do to inequality? What will they also do to poverty levels? So we know South Africa, 30.4 million people are living in multidimensional poverty as we speak. We also know that this has worsened as a result of COVID. We also know that the unemployment construct is a problem because of the labor market. No mention of the labor market policies, how we're going to deal with the economic structure that is unable to increase what I call employment intensity. So none of these questions are answered. None of these fundamental structural constraints are dealt with. We're simply hearing what we've heard, I would say, predecessors saying to us. Some slight adjustments here. Police, some more. They took it away, by the way. Health, a little bit more. They also took it away. And we can look at the numbers. But primarily, I don't necessarily see this budget taking us out of the quagmire that we are currently in. We really need innovation, doing the undoable or the unthinkable, things that have not yet been done. And I think to do the same thing over is not going to yield different results.
There's another way of looking at what you're saying, and I think I'm trying to stop myself nodding because I'm not supposed to agree with everything a guest says. But there's also a situation where some of our politics is almost in a stalemate, and I wonder if this is the result of that. The budget follows politics, perhaps, in that, as you say, for the last 10 years, we haven't really seen any kind of radical budget. Now, you could argue the last radical budget we saw was GEAR in 1996, and the pains within the liberation movement, the scars are still there as a result of that budget. The point I'm trying to make is that a budget is inherently political. You can't get away from that fact.
The political economy does drive the budget. The political economy drives policy. The political economy drives what policy imperatives are prioritized. So I think that is a reality that we cannot move ourselves from. The quagmire that we're in right now, though, requires that decisive will be taken on some of these interventions. For an example, if you look at the slow growth estimates, I think it is positive that the Minister of Finance has mentioned the issue of transforming regulations. That's policy, right? So that you can enhance infrastructure investment, particularly with the surplus that we see in the capital markets. That's a very positive move. I think it's also positive that there is relief going to the poor. We're seeing that fiscal response, similar to what we saw last year, some additional increment from the 26 billion to, I think he's mentioned now, almost 44 billion in terms of the social stress grant for COVID and related relief for another 12 months specifically. So it's timed, it's gated. And I think we're seeing also another positive that we're seeing is that we are now seeing some allocation to services such as police budget, medical interns, and very constrained services that need to be really given to those who need it in South Africa. And I think provinces that are struggling with the appointment of medical interns and doctors should really implement speedy measures so that they can make use of these budgets and they not return to Treasury. So it's one thing to allocate this money. The efficiency of spending it is another thing altogether. And monies are returned back from provinces, even departments, to Treasury after these allocations. So that efficacy, the technocrats we spoke about earlier, that has to also be on the cards. And it's not mentioned here. And I think these are some of the things that need to be spoken about so that you improve the efficiencies to spend better what he's announced.
In a way, one of the things that we saw today, and it was something that I probably knew but I didn't realize the extent of it, is that for every R1 that you pay in tax, 20 cents of that R1 that you pay in tax, 20 cents is actually going just to pay back debt. I mean, Dr. Moleko, that means that 20 cents of every rand that you pay in tax is also going to debt, right? That's an astonishing figure. I mean, that scares me. My father would never let me take on that much debt.
Listen, the debt to GDP issue is really, for me, a very critical point. We've got to be careful not to sound almost loose with debt to GDP, that a government and how it manages the debt to GDP. I want to focus on two things. He's mentioned now that there's an improvement in the allocation of revenue because of the tax windfall. That has reduced the budget balance to, I think the projected estimate is around 6%, next year 4.5%, etc. So there is an improvement from 7.8, even a projected 10 in the previous year. So we've performed better. Why is this? Is it because we've increased revenue? It's simply because we've increased our collections. So it's a primary, and remember, some of the projections around debt to GDP were sitting at, they had base projections and projections at almost 88% at some point. But now we're talking about 66, 70%.
75% was the predicted,
that's what he said.
The predicted peak.
Yes. So these estimates are moving numbers, but we know based on collections, based on some of the windfalls that we've seen, it may actually improve or not improve. But the key thing here is that it's a ratio. Debt to GDP. If your base, which is GDP, is not actually increasing, your collections of output, your collections from PAYE, collections from income tax, from companies, from individuals, households, VAT, if people are not working, you're not going to have a GDP. You're not going to have increased output. So what you should be focusing on is making sure that you increase growth.